Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and you're interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you that there are 2 upcoming NARM therapist trainings starting in January 2022. One of these trainings will be offered in an online format, and the other will be offered in person in San Francisco, California. This Level 2 NARM therapist training is designed to support mental health professionals who work with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Being trained in NARM, one of the first clinical models specifically designed to address ACEs and CPTSD, supports therapists to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The NARM therapist training will be taught by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer and a team of experienced NARM training assistants. You will learn a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach. As you're learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from this team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers. If you're interested in this training, we encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. Today's guest is Dr. Martin Lemon. Dr. Lemon is a clinical psychologist practicing in Chicago's western suburbs for more than 25 years. He has a special interest in the psychology of men and male identity. Beginning in 2006, Dr. Lemon developed a specific approach for group psychotherapy with men that he continues to refine in light of insights on developmental trauma that are emerging through his training in the neuroaffective relational model. Please enjoy Brad Kammer's conversation with Dr. Martin Lemon.
Well, welcome, Martin, to Transforming Trauma. So excited to have this conversation with you. You and I have known each other now for several years, and it's funny, I never really knew so much about the work you did with men and men's groups, and we were in a training together recently, and I heard you sharing about it, and I was just so inspired by the work. And first of all, great opportunity for you and I just to talk a little bit more. I always enjoy our conversations. But really the main intention is to understand this really powerful work that you're bringing to men in your community and wanting to know more about how NARM weaves into it, complex trauma, and anything else you'd like to share with our listeners. So welcome.
Thank you, Brad. It's great to have this opportunity to talk through this with you. I've been doing work primarily with men, and mostly men between the ages of, say, 35 and 75 for about 15 years now. And so it's great to have this opportunity to share some of that work and some of the insights I feel like I have acquired over time.
Great. The way we like to start here is just what would you like for listeners to get out of our time together? Is there anything that you'd really love for people to take away?
Well, my hope is that I can talk about this in a way that does give people some sense of the evolving psychology of men. It's a very interesting aspect of the field of psychology. And it's obviously something that I've been passionate about. And so I hope I'm able to convey some of that. The additional piece of training, and a lot of that, of course, is with you through NARM, has really enriched that work. And I hope to be able to talk about that too.
Great. Maybe a good place to start is just what got you into the men's work. I know you're a psychologist, but maybe giving listeners a little understanding of your trajectory and what brought you into this field and to your specialty.
Yes, I was just a newly minted psychologist with a new degree back in the early 90s. And I was invited by a colleague to attend a talk in Chicago here, given by a guy named Ronald Levant, Levant. The title of his talk was Normative Male Alexithymia. And listening, came to know that what he meant by that was that he believed that men are socialized in a way such that they don't have a very broad range of access to what they're feeling. And they have difficulty, many of them have difficulty talking about it, particularly with any nuance. So what Levant was saying was there are essentially 4 emotions that are emotional states that men are able to identify. They are being happy, being sad, being angry, or being sexually aroused. And he believed that, and still does, he's still doing this work, that there are ways men are socialized again that limit their awareness to those kinds of states. And when they are frustrated communicating in close relationships, he talked about how they often resort either to anger or withdrawal, and that really limits the richness of their experience of close relationships. So I went to that talk, and I then got a hold of his book, which is called Masculinity Reconstructed. It was published in about 1995, and really began to do some reading about this. And then I was invited to give a talk that I was completely unqualified for. I had no particular experience, but I was invited to give a talk on the psychology of men in midlife. And so I jumped at the chance, did a lot more reading. And in particular, I was drawn into the research of a pair of psychologists, well, actually one psychologist and one psychiatrist, who'd written a book called Men at Midlife. And the authors of that are Michael Farrell, Farrell, and Stanley Rosenberg. And they had done this really magnificent study back in the 1970s. It was published in the early 80s, in which they described a research project that had taken a decade to do. And they'd really taken a deep dive into trying to understand what is it about men's development through midlife that makes some men experience that as the richest time in their lives, and other men experience it as a time when the richness of their lives is waning, and they are looking back and feeling like the best years of their lives have passed. I've given entire talks on that book. I can describe it in more depth, but it is a remarkable piece of research. And the thing I'll just mention to start with that really grabbed me was one of the findings they had was that only 43% of men had even one person who would really qualify as a legitimate confidant. And one of the things that's great about this research is, they didn't just pass out a bunch of surveys and say, do you have any confidants? They looked at it from multiple angles and got multiple sources, including these gentlemen's wives and children, and some of them had adult children by that time. And so that number for their sample, which was considerable, about 300 men, is probably pretty solid, at least back in that time. And the research I continue to look at that comes out even today, I think confirms that that's still a significant issue, that there's a great deal of difficulty many, many men have in truly connecting in a viable way close relationships.
Yeah. Okay. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to pause it there, because I can see how this might link to you developing your men's groups earlier in your career. But if you're comfortable and open sharing, I also heard you talk about your own personal impact about learning more about masculinity or about your relationship to men through this process, and love to hear more about how that also informed you.
Well, okay. I came into psychology as a profession at all as an accident. I had no idea what a psychologist did. My only experience with that was watching the Bob Newhart show when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And I came from a rural area of Texas where there wasn't a mental health professional at that time within 100 miles in any direction. So I had zero exposure to psychology or psychotherapy. And then I was about a sophomore. I was a junior in college, and I went to a movie and was planning to go in one of these multiplex theaters. And by accident, my big brother in my fraternity and I went to this movie, and it was sold out. And so we said, well, what else is showing here? And they sent us to another movie. We had no idea what it was about. It was called Ordinary People. So by accident, I see Ordinary People. And I was just incredibly moved by that. I just could not believe how well they had captured family dynamics and also what could possibly be done by a mental health professional to try to impact what's going on in a family that's really struggling. And it was so inspirational to me. Within a few months, I had set aside my career direction as an accountant and decided I was going to become a psychologist. And so that's a long way of saying that's how I got into psychology. And I didn't realize at that point, I don't think, how much work I needed to do that particularly had to do with my own relationship with my father, which was very difficult for me. And it was later when I was introduced to men's work by Levant and by the readings I was doing that I eventually hit upon the idea of emphasizing working with men in my practice and with developing a particular model for group therapy.
Okay. So you were personally motivated through, this inspiration through the movie and how mental health professional could impact people and families. And then as you got deeper into the work and started learning about men's group, it also brought up some of this interest about your own relationship to your father, which I imagine then impacts your own relationship to being a man.
Yes.
And then how from there did that start to inform? So we're still talking many years before you've even come into the field of trauma or NARM. So how did this start to inform what you started doing in the early days of your men's work?
Well, let me also mention that by the time I went to this talk with Ronald Levant, it was probably the early 90s. 5 years or so before that, my father died. He had been killed in an airplane crash. And I think that one of the things that really struck me about this was also my own process of grieving my father's loss, the loss of my father, because I was feeling very stuck and not knowing how to do that, how to connect with what I thought I was supposed to feel. So there was that aspect of it too. And then, like I said, doing this research flipped my idea from being one of, I'm kind of choosing this odd career path to be in mental health, to maybe it's wondering about these things and trying to find ways to address them. That is some difficulties that men, and including me, have in figuring out what they are feeling and dealing with that and coming from an authentic place. Maybe it's not that there's something odd about me. Maybe there's some things odd about the world and about our culture. And so all of that was going on through a period of the 90s and early 2000s. And then it led to me taking a plunge in developing a new way to do group therapy.
So I'm curious about this piece about the culture. What were you starting to see about the culture, about our world that was impacting men?
One of the things is that I came to appreciate through a lot of reading and then through just a lot of my own reflecting and doing work with men in psychotherapy, I came to appreciate that men tend to experience their relationships with each other. They can experience those in a deep, heartfelt, emotional way, but they are largely based really on a sense of loyalty to each other and subtle signals they have in expressions and gestures and in things that are said that say, we are loyal to each other or not. And that's the bonding, the nature of a lot of male sense of being bonded in a significant relationship with each other. But that could go on even while there's really very little depth of understanding of each other, knowing relatively little about each other's lives and ways that the deeper explorations that we get into in psychotherapy, which those are not necessarily part of anyone's friendships, to some extent they are. So I'm not saying using psychotherapy and that kind of interaction as a model for how men ought to deal with each other. But I just came to this understanding that men were not using a lot of their emotional resources that they do have in order to connect with themselves and deal with each other and with their wives or their children or whomever in a place where they're coming from their hearts rather than coming from a kind of persona that most men have, that they're sincere in attempting to reach out to other people through this persona, but it's very limiting and they don't realize it.
We talk in NARM about differentiating between internal states and behaviors. And the thing that I've noticed as an adult in male relationships is many men actually relate through behaviors, like things they like to do together or talk about that they like to do together, whether they go fishing or they work on cars or sports or whatever that might be. And I think I'm hearing you say a little bit about this, that's valuable on some level and that there's a deeper layer that maybe a lot of men are missing, which is that heart connection.
It's true. But you and I know, Brad, that people can be together and be silent and still be communicating a lot. So I'm not talking here about critiquing men's relationships or their ways of engaging each other as much as I am about the limitations of it and the fact that there can be many more dimensions to it.
So how much of this, from your perspective, now that you've been in the field of developmental trauma, I mean, how much of this is really rooted in men not being fostered, boys not being supported or fostered, and then moving into adulthood with these capacities of how to really connect to another person that's not just through loyalty, not just through the behaviors, but through a deeper connection?
That is a very good question. And my sense about this is that for quite some time now, the opportunities that this would somehow flip and that there would be some sort of really profound change in the way men are able to do this. The opportunity for that is just so present, but it doesn't quite happen. So here I was reading these things in the 90s, and I was thinking, well, people are going to read this and it's going to change our culture. how naive I was. Culture is one of the very hardest things to change. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what the cultural ingredients are that make this difficult. And in terms of just maturation and development, there's something that seems to happen around early adolescence in particular, in my view, and maybe before that, where boys, whether they intend to or not, and often their parents and their teachers, whether they intend it or not, they get the message that the most important thing is to be strong, a particular kind of strength. And that involves not showing emotion. It involves pushing through when things are difficult and not doing anything that would lead to you being accused of being soft or a pansy or whatever label you want to put on that. And those kinds of labels are really devastating, or the possibility that someone could call you that, for young men. And so there's something that happens through that time of development that really is quite impactful.
Yeah, that really hit me as you were talking about that, just thinking about my own childhood and raising two boys. And I can really see the very strong cultural messages that come towards boys to, you didn't use this language, but I'm thinking about just like dimming down their sensitivity or actually completely suppressing their sensitivity. And these messages about a certain kind of strength. I think you implied that because you and I know that when you're really able to be in your vulnerability and be in your heart, that is strength. That is real strength. That is real resilience.
And that's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I really liked about Ronald Levant's writing was he was not trying to soften men. He was fully acknowledging that there are aspects of what we might think of as traditional masculinity, the ability to postpone gratification, to push through difficult emotions in stressful situations, to put the needs of your family or your community ahead of your own. Those things are absolutely legitimate. So I love the fact that he acknowledges those things at the same time that he says there are still great limitations that men, they seem to have difficulty getting out of their own way when it comes to experiencing rich, close relationships.
Yeah. As you've been talking, I don't know how well versed you are in this territory, but of course, in our society, the whole concept of gender is being expanded and revisited and redefined in various ways. I wonder if you have anything to say about that in terms of our conversation about how developmental trauma or just the norms in our society might be impacting us.
It's interesting. And I don't claim in any way to be greatly knowledgeable about those kinds of things. I wonder how that is going to play out and how much impact that will have. Of course, what you're talking about, an awakening in certain parts of our society to those kinds of issues, there's a lot of conflict over that too. So that's certainly not universal, but it's going to take time to tell whether those kinds of changes really impact what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is men's propensity to disconnect from themselves. And because you don't specify gender in the same way at a certain age or whatever, does that have the capacity to change some of this fundamentally? The answer to that is I don't know.
Yeah, I really appreciate you, being open to it. And also, I really like the theme of this disconnection that you're bringing in. Of course, we're going to get to how this might align with some of the NARM principles. Now let's go back to you developing these groups. And what is the intention of your groups? And how do you start working with these different strategies of disconnection? Give us some more sense of what you're actually doing in these groups and some of the impact of them.
Okay, so first, I developed a particular way of structuring work in groups with men before I was ever exposed to NARM. So I'm going to describe how I conceived of this and then how it's also been developing and augmented by my understanding of NARM. But the original, I don't know if you'd call it an insight, but it was, I was hoping it was an insight, was that men tend to relate to each other with a certain sense of their identity, which in most cases is a persona. I relate to you in terms of I'm this professional, or I'm this person who's this community leader, or I'm this person who does this kind of labor and has an expertise in that, or whatever it is. And again, talking about the lack of depth of relationships. So what I decided to try, and it was a complete shot in the dark. I'd never heard anyone starting a group like this before. Men were probably 75% of my individual clients by this time. And I decided to just take a leap and try to structure groups a different way. So I got together a group of about 7 men who were working with me individually, and I knew them pretty well. And I said, I'd like to invite you to be part of a men's group. And the idea behind the men's group would be that oftentimes we, as men, we don't relate to each other except through a kind of mask that we have on. And so what if in this group, I introduced each of you 7 guys to each other in great depth? If everyone knew this going into the group from the start, if I told everyone, okay, I'm going to take about 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to say, okay, this is John, and this is his age, and this is his occupation and his circumstances. This is what I have been working on with him for some time. And then here's what I understand about his life and his development. So it's an experience of everyone having cards put on the table. And then I gave them some coaching. I said, oftentimes men talk to each other and they relate through their own experience. So if someone's having trouble in business, for instance, and someone will say, I've been through something like that. I had to deal with that kind of situation. And that is meant with the best of intentions, but it tends to shut down communication. And I said, okay, instead of doing that, in this group, I'd like you to think about it like the old basketball metaphor. You go down the court, I want you to pass the ball 5 times before anybody shoots. So in this case, I would invite you to just keep asking questions. Rather than offer anything from your own experience, ask clarifying questions. And the goal is that the person who's been talking about their own lives, or maybe it's somebody I've been introducing, but whatever the case, the person on whom the attention is focused at the moment, I want that man to have the experience that there are people who are partners with him. He's following the thread of what he wants to open up and explore about. And all the other men in the group they're supporting that by asking particular kinds of questions to clarify or reflective kinds of comments, those kinds of things. And it's fine for you ultimately to get to a place where you offer your own reflections or advice, but try to be sure to ask plenty of questions and give that individual a deepened experience of opening up before you do any of that. And the reason is, if you do eventually offer feedback or advice, you're probably going to be able to offer much better feedback because you know more, and it's more likely to be received because this person feels like you know more.
Yeah, it seems really profound. I have experiences in men's groups, and the group that I was in for the longest period of time was much more of an encounter group. And the sense was that we were there to challenge each other in a certain way. There was a lot of moments of connection, but what was missing, I think, is this curiosity that you've brought in, that it's okay to challenge people once you are connected. Once you have that curiosity, understand more about their experience, then the challenges or the confrontations might be much more attuned to actually where they are, as opposed to what you might think they need to do or should do.
Exactly. And I found that just almost all of the men I've worked with in the past 15 years in my groups would have said they never envisioned themselves being in a men's group or any kind of psychotherapy group. And then they experience it. Not everyone. There's some people who find it's not for them, but the majority of them certainly find that it's a different way of relating to people. And it's as if they're unburdened by the reputation or the sense of themselves that they've been trying to hold up, and they didn't realize how much a burden that created.
Yeah. Do there tend to be themes? I mean, like, are there things that the men are saying that they're not able to process with their spouses or with their friends that ends up becoming kind of the territory that you explore together? Or can it be really anything?
It can be anything, but the theme that we tend to gravitate back to is just this basic distinction between how I try to present myself and what it means to be authentic, or at least a closer approximation of that.
So I'm curious, you said that you started these groups before you came into learning about NARM, even though I'm actually hearing a lot of alignment already with the focus on intentionality and curiosity. But how has NARM helped evolve the work that you're doing in the groups?
Well, in several particular ways, but they're subtle. I don't think that the men in my group would say, wow, he's doing things completely different today than he was. But for one thing, I often start the group by saying, okay, I invite all of you guys to think what you would like for yourselves from this group today. And I just offer a few supportive comments that's a really good way of you aligning yourself, not just in terms of, okay, am I self-conscious, or am I going to be afraid that I'm saying too much or too little, all those kinds of things. See if you can set those things aside and be clearer about what is it you would like for yourself. And certainly, there are times when people are just confused. They don't know what to do with that. But over time, there's a kind of modeling that they do for each other, and it helps them get on track. So that's one thing. Another thing is in my interventions in the group, which in my own training in how to do group therapy, one of the rules of thumb tended to be that the less that's said by the group therapy leader, the better. It's probably a group if you said very few things. But of those few things that I do say, I find as a result of my training in NARM that I am much less likely to sort of jump on a bandwagon and try to support some positive aspect of something that someone's talking about. I'll give a recent example. There was about 3 groups ago, there was a guy who was talking about, he works for a big corporation, and he was talking about a very difficult situation he had come into. He had been part of a project where this corporation was pitching business to another big company. And he, at some point, was examining this whole proposal. And he said to himself, there's things here that we're not going to be able to make good on that. And he spoke up then to his superiors and stuck his neck out in a way and made these points in a very cogent way. And it stopped him dead in the tracks. And they had to recalibrate and say, okay, we're going to have to do this differently. So he was talking about this, and one of the other group members was really taken by his courage and really wanted to support that aspect of it. And the group developed in an interesting way from that point. And my sense was, and I offered a few comments at various times, was that it was more important to stay on the thread of what is this guy's experience, not helping him divide the good things he did from the bad things he did, or the strong from the weak, but just to stay with him through that. And I think that he had a deeper experience as a result of that.
Yeah, it's a really nice example. Holding the complexity of it as opposed to choosing one side to promote.
Exactly. And it also conveys a kind of faith you have that the person, if they're given support and genuine support, there's an awful lot that people can do with that. There's a different kind of exploration they can do within themselves.
Yeah, I mean, we use the word agency in NARM, of course, and it's about a certain kind of trust that even if they make a decision that happens to be quote unquote the wrong decision, we're trusting that they will be able to stay connected even as the consequences emerge. And there's another level to it that I'm sure that these men that you've put together in this group will also be there to support him, even if this whole thing ends up, imploding on him. And it's actually what I'd like to talk about at some point, but just about the community building aspect of it, of having people that actually have your back. I mean, you talked about your own challenges with your father. I had, I think, similar challenges with my father, not really feeling like I had adult men, or my father that really had my back in that way. And to be in an environment where you actually have other men that are holding you in that way, it just seems, again, very powerful.
I think it's a very powerful experience and a rare experience.
Yeah.
One of the most profound experiences I had before doing these groups with regard to connection with men was actually my college fraternity experience. And I'm still good friends with those guys, and that bond is real, but it's the same thing. And in a lot of ways, there's not a lot of depth of knowledge that I know about a lot of those guys. And I'm certainly not knocking what that experience was like. And that bond is real. I feel it.
Yeah. I mean, you had the experience of the fraternity. I think some men go into the military and have those lifelong bonds. But again, they're loyalty bonds, as you mentioned before, but not necessarily on this deeper connection.
Yes. And what escapes most men is that there is a lot of richness they can find by opening up, and which is not the same thing as weakness, as you and I are both confirming. You have the dual awareness in a close relationship. One is following the thread of what you need to talk about, and the other is, how am I being received? And is this person really staying with me? And to the extent they can, or that they do, that relationship deepens. But there's so little experience, except under special circumstances, that men tend to have with that.
Yeah, I think that's important to highlight, of how rare this really is in our society, and what a gift for these. I mean, I'm sure when they come to see a psychologist, they're not thinking about this invitation that's going to come at some point that's going to completely revolutionize their life. And that's why I wanted to have you on. I really wanted us to be able to learn from you, and just to get a sense of how you're doing this. I have another personal question. Again, you're welcome to answer or not answer. But one of the things I've noticed, being, mental health professional, and then now as a training leader, as a training instructor, there's this interesting role between you're facilitating groups that have a lot of depth, I'm hearing, and you're a part of that. And you're not exactly a part of that. And I wonder how that is for you. I have my own experience about that, but I'd be curious for you about how that is to see all this connection, and you're supporting and facilitating the connection, and you are part of the connection, and you're also not, because of the role.
Well, my first answer to that question is, it's been the most rewarding thing I've done in my career. And it's intensely gratifying to support men in doing this kind of thing, and to see them make the strides that they make. I can't say enough how gratifying that is. But my role in that group is not to be a member of the group. And that goes back to one of the things I know you emphasize, which is, we as mental health professionals need to take advantage of opportunities for ourselves to get help. As a matter of fact, I'm in the process of organizing a kind of group among several males who are in NARM training right now, so we can work with each other, help each other.
That makes a lot of sense. Then, yeah, creating a group where you can be a member as opposed to being the facilitator.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But having said that, though, I learn a lot vicariously from seeing these guys interact with each other. And I see different kinds of strengths develop, which before they might have reverted to anger, or just cutting somebody off and not pursuing a relationship with them. And they stay with it in a different way. I learn a lot vicariously about a different kind of strength. It's possible to come from a place within yourself that is more settled, more genuine, more aware. It's like, another metaphor I use is, it's a football metaphor. It's like, men oftentimes believe the greatest asset they have is determination. So it's like you're a running back and it's 4th and 1, and you're against a stacked defense. It's just who's more determined. And what the work in NARM does oftentimes is it helps people spread things out. So rather than it being 4th and 1 against a stacked defense, you're in the open field running and you've got all of these different possibilities, and it's exciting. And well, there's a lot of different kinds of emotions that can come with it, but there's a sense of being freed up because you have a different well within yourself, a deeper well within yourself of strength to draw upon.
Yeah, I'm just really struck by, you've talked about strength, you talked about this determination, and that these are some of the things that end up getting amplified that then we group into this concept of toxic masculinity. And I've worked on this myself and thought about this a lot, but just of the binds that boys who grow up in cultures that are showing them that there's really one way to be a man. And it really is through this toxic masculinity. And as you get older, then, we do what we do to adapt to our society and to our family system and to our culture. And then we ourselves start to embody some of that cultural learning. And then there's some relationship to the shame and pride that we talk about in NARM, where it's like there's a pride because that determination, that strength is what keeps us moving into adulthood. But there's also the shame about like we're also then perpetuating the disconnection and also people acting out in different ways. And I think that's missing in our cultural discussions around masculinity. I think the nuance of how many, many men feel trapped by that toxic masculinity. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I can imagine a lot of people are listening here and thinking we're looking at this quite one-sided, but there is a lot of nuance.
Okay, so if I can use some personal example from my life. So my father was at once the person that I most admired in the world, really, and also the person that I feared his judgment terribly. And I think that especially by the time I got to be an adolescent, his method, if you want to call it that, of being a father, it had the implicit message, which was you'll prove your masculinity by figuring it out on your own. There was a lot of just like, you figure it out. Of course, when you do figure some things out, it's like you've found nuggets of gold and there's great pride around that, but it does miss all these other dimensions. And I think that too often men are caught in this trap of thinking, okay, should I be nurturing? But is that going to just be too soft and coddling? And is that going to make my son soft? He's going to have to go out in the same world I went into. You're not going to make it that way. But it's not about soft or severe. It's about understanding how connection works. And connection can be a great and incredible asset through our most difficult challenges.
Goes back to what I heard you saying before, that NARM has really supported you, is to hold more of the complexity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know if I specifically got to your question, though, about toxic masculinity. There's one other thing I'd like to refer to. This book I mentioned earlier by Farrell and Rosenberg and Men in Midlife. What it comes down to is they have this very brilliant way of characterizing 4 different paths that men can be on. And at the time, they did some very sophisticated research to use their sample to try to get at what percentage of men are on each of these paths. Now, I don't know how much those would apply today. That was 1981, but I have a sense the percentages wouldn't be that different. One of the 4 paths was the one that everyone would like to be on, which I believe they call transformative generative, which means men by midlife feel like they have learned a lot from their difficult lessons. They have rich relationships in family and in work. They feel like there's possibilities in front of them. And it's not as if their road has been an easy one, but as I say, they've learned from mistakes, both professional and personal, and those kinds of things. That's only about 34% in their estimation. The other 3 groups are struggling. One of those it's actually the smallest group, but they are people who are having a genuine midlife crisis. They can see all sorts of things that are not going well, and they blame themselves. And those men are at risk for all sorts of problems, including suicide. And as you know, the rate of successful completion of suicide among males compared to females, it's almost 4 times as high. And a lot of this is because men cling to that idea that I alone ought to be able to figure this out. Those are 2 of the 4. The third is and I'm going to get around to the toxic masculinity thing. The third is guys who are putting an awful lot of effort into making it look like they're doing great. They're sort of pseudo developed. And they, in order to bolster that, they're vulnerable to getting into a lot of substance abuse, a lot of drinking. They are oftentimes acquiring a lot of debt to try to make look like they're more successful than they are. But that group, fortunately from this research, they had spouses and so forth reporting on these, giving a very different report than the individuals were when they're talking about themselves. And then there's the fourth group. The fourth group are people who, if you remember, the second group are people who are struggling and they blame themselves.
Yeah.
The fourth group are struggling and they blame everyone else. The world has done me wrong. I didn't get the shot that I should have gotten. This happened and that happened. And they're bitter. And the only way those men have to connect with each other is by getting together with other men who feel something of the same way and the same sorts of grievances. And those people tend to exemplify what you're talking about as toxic masculinity. And they are also very vulnerable to having some other leader come along that they then admire, and they're all in.
That makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate how you were differentiating that. And you had said something before earlier about like men in midlife who either are able to stay connected and feel like they're having a rewarding, fulfilling experience. And then I think 2 of the 4 are the opposite direction. These are people that in different ways aren't feeling the fulfillment of their lives as they're moving forward in life.
Yeah, 3 of the 4 are not feeling it.
Oh, I'm sorry, 3 of the 4. Okay. Right. And in the book, or even just based on your perspective, what are some of the main ingredients? What are some of the main pillars that are for this one group that are able to feel more fulfilled, to more connected? And maybe these are some of the things that you're working on in your groups.
Well, the most obvious one is a healthy vulnerability. Even coming to understand what vulnerability is and what it feels like to be honest about what you're struggling with people you deeply trust. And that trust has to be carefully developed. But that is really the hallmark of it. And then you learn so much through that. You learn saying things about yourself. You also learn how to relate to other people, how to connect with other people. And you can provide things that then are richly rewarding through the next decades of your life. And one of the hallmarks of midlife is you're in the transition from what for most people is the most productive part of their lives, career-wise, to a part where you are advising other people, you're enjoying your family relationships, and your life will be very rich in that regard if you've come to terms with what it means, how to be vulnerable. And that's something, even saying that, I think many men would reject that out of hand. What does that even mean? And it takes some care to really help them understand what that could mean.
I had this realization, I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but since I started teaching 20 years ago, I really prided myself on being like a real authentic teacher. Like I would say it like it is. I was transparent. It was just something that felt right to me based on my personality and how I wanted to show up in my classes. And recently, really recently, in the last couple of years, I started to sense into that transparency is not the same as vulnerability. And that in some ways, some of my desire to be so transparent was actually a strategy for blocking my vulnerability. And when I started to realize that, it blew my mind, because it was like I thought I was just so vulnerable because I was so transparent, but those were not the same things. And I'm really mindful of this now in my teaching and how I show up. It's like I can feel that more. I have a lot more work to do around it. And I think some of it really plays into my own lineage, my own intergenerational trauma, and a lot of my trauma in my male lineage that I'm still working through. But it's just been so interesting to kind of feel that real subtlety of how here I was for so many years thinking I'm just out there in the world as such this vulnerable man. And in some ways, my transparency was actually a strategy of blocking that.
That's a beautiful expression of that experience and insight, Brad. And I mean, to me, it just goes to show what a continuing journey it is. And there's subtleties that lead to more awareness and more capacity to be present with yourself and be present with the people you're connecting with. And that's one of the things that I've just been so grateful to NARM about, which is these concepts of strategies as opposed to being able to set those aside, and how that affects your sense of your basic identity and how to support yourself through the work that you do to get to the next phase with that.
Well, this just feels like a continuation of these really rich discussions that you've started. And I'm glad that you and I get to do this one-on-one here today. And I think we're going to have a lot more of these moving forward. I have a feeling, because I'm so interested in learning more. And, we're part of this community together, and you're helping us also develop some of our understanding. I just wonder if, as we start wrapping up here, if there's anything else left over that you'd like to share that listeners might be able to take away from what we've been talking about.
I just appreciate your whole way of conducting this interview. I haven't done a podcast before. I was pretty anxious for the last several days, to tell you the truth. Just to be honest, to be vulnerable myself. But thank you very much for the way this has gone. I appreciate learning from you, learning with you, and your very real support.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs, in addition to other resources, on the website, www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.